Hello and welcome. This is how to cut and install crown molding. I'm Ron. This is Mike, and together we're going to give you some step-by-step instruction and guidance, some tips and some tricks so you can cut and install that crown molding. But before we get there, Mike, how about you give us a rundown on the workshop?
No problem. We're going to give you an overview of different types of molding because you may not realize there is crown molding in your house, but there's also other types of molding. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll also talk about style and material because you've got a couple of decisions to make when you're choosing the crown molding that you're going to use. The style and look of it and the material that it's made of. So we'll go through that. Also, we'll talk about planning and prepping. Going through the process of measuring for how much molding you need and then cutting the molding. And of course, we'll end up with the installation of the molding. So we'll walk you through all the basic steps of the process. Now, I do want to point out, most people probably think that crown molding is a really complicated process. It's really not. There's some very detailed measuring and cutting that you need to do, and you've got to really take your time and focus on that to get it right so that it all goes together seamlessly. But in terms of the overall project, it's not overly complex. There's not that many steps, and we really think it's a project that just about any DIYer can take on. So Ron, with that overview out of the way, walk us through the different types of molding that you'll find in a home.
Love to, but before I get to types of molding, I think it's important that we kind of give a giant kind of umbrella overview on materials. Now, the different material types with all molding are going to break down into wood, and that can be stained grade or a primed type of wood. It can come in hardwood, it can come in a pine. Mike's going to run us through that in a little bit more detail. You got an MDF or a medium density fiberboard. He's going to tell you what that is all about. Then we've got some PVC or foam type material as well, and even a rubber type molding for archways and different things like that. So now that you kind of got an idea about how that molding materials is looking and the things that are out there for us, let's break how to select the molding. When I say select, what I mean is you've got to determine the locations because different moldings have different types of locations, but you can use some moldings interchangeably. So how I want to break this down by location is I want to talk to you a little bit about ceiling. I want to talk to you a little bit about wall. I want to talk to you a little bit about that floor. And then finally, around those doors and windows. Now, when we break down that ceiling, what we're looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is crown molding or ceiling medallions. Crown molding will definitely add some warmth and some character to your home. It's worth the investment. We talk chair rails. They're designed to protect the wall from scuffing or any kind of damage. You go down a little bit further, then we've kind of got a picture rail. And Mike, they're designed to display plates and artworks and things like that. And then there's some wanes coating. These are installed between baseboards and chair rolling or a picture rail, kind of like a little framed panel. And then there is actually panel molding used to frame out walls that have wall paneling. Then, of course, there's board and batten, and we use that as a trim piece to cover up joints from the paneling itself. And then around those doors and windows, ladies and gentlemen, we all have that casing. Comes in lots of different profile types, different thicknesses, and that is designed to cover up the gap between the drywall and the actual framed out window jamb or door jamb. And then last but not least, Mike, we got the floor. And what we got on the floor is we got baseboard or some shoe molding covering that floor. And then, of course, that base is always going to be a little thinner than traditional molding because you do not need a large, thick piece of molding on that floor.
Now, you might be thinking, why are we talking about all these different types of molding? There's two reasons. We wanted to give you some context for how crown molding fits in to the world of molding and let you know that there is molding all over your house. But the main reason is the process for measuring, cutting, and installing all of those different types of molding. It's all very, very similar. So once you go through this workshop and you've installed your crown molding, you might want to take on a different project. Maybe you want to add one of those things that Ron mentioned that maybe you don't have in your house, or maybe you need to replace something that you have in your house. Once you do the crown molding project, you'll know everything you need to know to do those other projects.
Mike, I'll tell you that if you can nail down how to install crown, the sky's the limit when it comes to molding. It's probably going to be on a scale. It's going to probably be higher up there than say baseboard or shoe molding or even door casing. So this is cool because this is going to open up a whole new world to you. Now, Mike, how would one go about selecting that molding?
Well, there's a few things you want to consider when you're selecting the right crown molding for your house. When you go into the store and you go into the molding aisle, it can be a little bit overwhelming. A lot of you maybe have never been in the molding aisle because you've never needed to go over there. But when you walk down that aisle, it's a lot of molding, a lot of materials. They're really tall and they all look the same. So you may not even know, like, where do I even start? But some of the things you need to think about is the size, because molding does come in different sizes. The really important part about that is scale. Based on the size of your room, if you've got a really large room, you probably want a larger molding. If you have a small room, you probably want a smaller molding. Now, of course, like with any other project, you're free to do whatever you want. Whatever you like is okay. This is not a law, it's just a guideline. But the size is one thing to consider. The other thing is the style. All molding has a profile or a personality. They all look different and they all have different styles. So that's another thing you want to think about. Maybe if you already have molding in your house and you want to match that, or maybe you want to do something completely different, you're free to do that too. But the profile or shape of the molding is another thing you need to think about. There's another thing that we really won't get into today, but it's called stacking or building up. It's a more advanced molding process, but you can take different pieces of molding and combine them to install them to make an even different, larger, very unique piece of molding in your house. But then the other things you need to think about are location, style, and budget. So we talked a little bit about style. Budget comes into play because there are price differences in all these different types, and location. Some are more appropriate, maybe in a wet area like a bathroom. So another thing you need to think through. But as far as the categories of what you've got to decide, there's basically two categories. There's wood and then there's non-wood. Let's focus on the wood first. There are hardwoods that are out there. They're very classic, traditional. They have a very distinctive grain pattern. These generally are going to be stained. You don't want to spend the money that it takes to get that kind of wood because they are more expensive because of the wood grain. You don't want to paint over that necessarily. So those are generally used when people just want to stain, right? So you want to see that wood grain. And again, they're a little bit more expensive. But things like cherry, oak, walnut, mahogany, those are the higher end woods that you might consider. But then there's also pine. Pine is probably more popular because A, it's less expensive, but you've got options. You can stain the pine because there is a wood grain, but most people will probably end up painting that. So you've got two options with the pine. But there's also non-wood products like medium density fiberboard or MDF. That's a high grade composite material and it's made to be painted. They generally come primed, so they're ready to be painted. And the finish is very smooth. So you're going to have a nice finished, look when you get done installing it. There's also PVC foam that can be used in place of wood, but it's really good for wet areas. So if you're doing a bathroom, maybe a laundry room, not as big of a problem there, but really in a bathroom where moisture is a concern, you can go with the PVC foam model. Now, Ron, we've talked about the different types. What about crown molding? Let's focus a little bit more on crown molding.
Well, that's what we're here to do. It sounds good to me. Now, there are a lot of choices for crown. I'm going to kind of go through some of those considerations and what to kind of look for when choosing crown. Before we kind of get into size and style again, I want to go ahead and show you some. I want to go ahead and go to a different camera view, just kind of show you some of the layouts. What you got there is you got what we call our stock type of crown. That is an MDF material. You can definitely see that. And what I want to go ahead and call out on this particular piece, you see how smooth that is? That's going to hide brush marks. If you're going to brush it, this is a good material to use on a brush because typically grained type of wood and depending on the brush you're going to use are going to have some brush marks. And depending on how high it is, you're really not going to see that. But this is a great material. I want to keep out of wet places with this because MDF is most certainly going to kind of not be very good with water. All right, so that's a stock crown. You can see we've got a 3.5 inch or 3 5/8 inch piece on the right and a bigger piece on the left. I don't exactly know how big that is. I think it might be a 4.5 or 5 inch piece of crown. As you can see, it comes in lots of different flavors, sizes. And that is the stock crown option you're going to see at Home Depot. And then you've got some intricate crown options. You can see we've got a rope pattern on the top. That's about a 3 5/8 inch piece. It's going to be a little bit more expensive, but this is a pine option as well. This is an unfinished stained grade pine. And then you've got a super intricate one on the bottom. You can see the sky's the limit with this stuff. Now, there's only going to be so many that are going to be available in the stores, but if you go out to homedepot.com, there is an endless aisle of a lot of other options as well. Now we have what we call a dental pattern. As you can see, this is kind of a very intricate pattern. It's got that little dental shell for dental edges there. You've got a smaller one. This is about 2.5, and then the bottom one is about a 3.5 or 4 inch. And you can see the profiles on the side when you go to homedepot.com. That's going to be outlined in black for you. So you're going to be able to see exactly what kind of profiles that you're getting. Now, as you can see, we've only showed you a couple of those. Now let's kind of break down size and we talk a little bit about style, but those are the biggest factors when considering that crown for your room. So the range, Mike, in those widths is going to range between 2.5 inches and 20 inches. Imagine a 20-inch wide piece of crown, one piece. How big would that room have to be? Probably the Sistine Chapel or something like that.
You've got a grand hall, a grand dining hall in your house, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. And then, of course, we got some general guidelines. Once again, like Mike said, I'm not telling you absolutely what to use, but I'll give you some general guidelines. 8-foot ceilings, you're looking at anywhere from 2.5 inches to 6 inches. Those 9-foot ceilings, looking at about 3 inches to 7.5, 10-foot, 3.5 to 8 inches. And it kind of goes on. As you can see, it staggers by feet, maybe an inch per, but nobody's telling you you can't put a 20-inch piece of crown in an 8-foot room. It just would make the room look really small.
Yep.
Now, it's important to know that crown connects to your wall and your ceiling, and it should sit flush on the wall and flush on the ceiling. It's designed for that. So, we're going to go ahead and quickly show you kind of what it looks like on the wall. So both moldings in this picture are great choices, but choosing the right size to match is super important, and it will absolutely complement the room. You can see in the slide the smaller version behind and the bigger version on top.
So Ron, real quick, is it a good idea? You can see in this picture, it appears that they're covering up an older, smaller piece of molding. When is that okay and when is it not okay?
That's a good question.
Right.
The rule of thumb is the molding has to be bigger. It has to be able to cover up that molding. If it covers up the molding, you're not going to see the molding behind it. And another good point is if the original molding was actually anchored correctly using the studs and the joists and the ceiling and the wall, then you can use the old molding as an anchoring point for your new molding. But you're going to want to check the old molding first, kind of put like a little, putty knife up in there and wiggle it around a little bit. And you're going to be able to feel it if it's actually anchored to the joist and a stud. If it's not, it's going to wiggle a little bit and you don't want it to wiggle. You want to go ahead and put that in the studs and the joists.
So you're looking for a non-wiggle situation.
Non-wiggle situation.
Another thing to think about, again, if you're not quite sure if your new molding is bigger enough to cover up the old molding, just know that these two, I don't know if you can see this too well, but the two flat parts, these have to make really good contact with the ceiling and the wall. So as long as they do and they're clearing the old molding, you're good to go. But if this is contacting the old molding and it's affecting how well it's connecting, then you probably need to remove the old molding.
So Mike, why don't you talk to us about style?
Well, believe it or not, there are over 40 different profiles. And, when we say profile, we mentioned this, but it literally is the profile, of the molding. But in the world of molding, there are about 40 types. There's Federal, Greek, Early American, Georgian, Colonial, Craftsman. I wouldn't get too caught up on the name. It's really about what you like, what fits your home, or to Ron's point, what you just want to experiment with, maybe in a particular room of your house. But using a certain type is an opportunity for you to really let your design and your personality kind of shine. You can kind of do whatever you want and create the look that you want. If you're looking for inspiration, there's a lot of places to do that. There's different design shows, there's magazines, neighbors' homes. If you go on a tour of homes and you see molding, you're like, wow, that's really cool. You can use any of that as inspiration. But at the end of the day, it's really about picking something that you like, regardless of the rules or the guidelines, and just making your home, creating that special kind of look in your house. Now, Ron, What's first? Where do we start? We've gone through all of the prep stuff as far as what to think about, but now we're ready to actually get started on the project.
I'm ready too. I hope you guys are ready. But my dad always said before you start anything, you got to have a plan. Don't have a plan and you don't work your plan, you got a plan to fail. So that's where we're going to start.
Here are some things to consider when planning out your project. Before you start, you will need to measure the room. First, measuring lets you know how much molding you need to buy. Second, it helps you identify the specific cuts and pieces you'll need and where they will be installed. This will also help you create the layout for the project.
There are two popular methods for documenting measurements and organizing your project: making a diagram of the room and labeling each wall, or marking the measurements directly on the wall where the piece will be installed. You can also do both if you like.
Labeling your walls and the corresponding cuts is the easiest way to keep organized when you're making cuts and also helps you reduce waste. You should plan to buy 10 to 20% more molding than you need for your project in case you do make any mistakes. If you don't need that extra, you can always return it to your local Home Depot.
If you think you want to get a few practice cuts in before using your project material, there are always inexpensive scrap pieces of molding available at your store to bring home for practice.
Now, you've measured and you know where your molding is going, but before cutting and installing, there are a few things you can do to make the install easier. First, locate and mark wall studs and ceiling joists along your molding path.
You can use painter's tape to mark the wall and ceiling. You just want to make sure that your marks are above or below where the molding goes so you can see them when nailing in your molding.
Plan your way around the room. Use your diagram to plan where your pieces go and where your cuts will need to be made. Sometimes you can use a single piece of molding for an entire wall, but most of the time the molding is shorter than the wall and you will need to join two or more pieces together.
It's important to have an idea of where everything will go before you start making cuts. That way you can plan for the least number of cuts and reduce waste. For example, outside corners are more visible, and you may want to start with those to make sure they fit properly before moving on to other parts of the room. Imperfections are easier to hide in inside corners.
The next step is to actually go to the store and purchase your molding. Before you head out, be sure to give some thought to the molding material you prefer and the profile or shape of the molding. And again, don't forget to get extra.
You can also pick up other supplies like nails, caulk, and wood filler. And don't forget, if you're not sure that you're ready to invest in power tools, like a nail gun or a miter saw, you can rent those from the Home Depot Tool Rental Center.
Okay, so let's focus on a couple of the important points of things that we mentioned in the video. First, the measuring. Obviously, measuring all of your walls together and adding them up is going to give you the total amount of molding that you need. But how does that work in practical terms? Know this: when you go into the store to get your molding, most of the molding that we sell is sold in 16-foot lengths. So what you need to do is not only think about the total amount that you need to purchase based on all of your individual walls, but you also need to think about how you're going to apply those individual pieces of molding to the walls. In other words, when you get your diagram and you look around the room and you think about the different lengths of wall, let's say you have a 12-foot wall. Well, that's going to be 12 foot of one of those pieces of 16-foot molding, which means you're going to have another 4 foot left over. The next step would be, first, label that 12-foot piece of that one piece of molding on your diagram, but then look around to think, can I utilize that 4 feet piece somewhere else? Maybe you have a 3-foot wall. If you have a 5-foot wall, it's not going to work. But, think about all of the different walls and how you're going to divide up that molding that you've purchased.
Absolutely. And also want to consider like complete linear footage too. Like you might have a wall that's more than 16 foot. You might have a wall that, you're only going to have 2 or 3 foot left off that 16-foot run of material. Not always a good idea to just put that piece up there, because when you're connecting those two pieces, as we're going to show you further in the workshop, when you scarf joint things together, you want that joint to land on a stud, Mike, because you don't want it to separate. So really put some thought into where you want those to put. And here's another little tip for you. While you're in the store, if you know your diagram is dialed in and you know that everything is good to go, you could just do some preliminary cuts right there at the scrap thing. You can cut a couple of 16 footers down. Maybe you don't have the ability to actually cart them out the store. So you want to cut them down a little bit, make it a little easier to carry. You can do that. But as you're cutting them, go ahead and write on the back of that molding. This is going to be for this wall. This is going to be for that wall. When you get them home, drop them in them locations, leaving them a foot or two longer than what they need to be. So you have some cut room, if you will, right? So it's all good to go. One other thing is about off the video, make sure to seal those gaps in the corners. No matter how tight the miter is, there's probably going to be a little bit of variation. As you go to put them on the wall a little tiny bit, there's going to be maybe a tiny bit of a gap. Don't worry about that. You can put some wood filler in there, right? Then sand them flush. You can also just caulk them at the end, especially if they're being painted.
Yeah, just know no matter how good of a job you do of making these cuts, even if they're perfect, it's still a seam. You're still going to want to like perfect that seam and fill it in. But there will be times, even if you do all of the steps right, you've measured correctly, you've cut correctly, you're still sometimes going to have a slight gap only because of the way it actually ends up on the wall. That's okay. That's totally normal. You can fill that in. Nobody's ever going to know that's there because you can fix that. So don't worry about that. The other thing we wanted to mention is giving some thought to where your cuts are. So again, if you measure your wall and you decide to make a cut, the second part of that is to think about the studs. So you've gone through and marked where those studs are. If you're aligning your molding and thinking about a cut, maybe you've got a 12-foot piece left over that you're trying to apply. If that end of that molding doesn't align with the stud, you can't use the 12-foot. You've got to cut it back to align with the stud so that it's really firmly attached. That's where you're going to make a seam within two pieces. And whatever's left in that wall, you'll need to cut to account for that.
Yep.
So again, that's where your diagram can come into place. Not only where your molding is going, but where your cuts are going.
And then the last thing, and then we're going to go ahead and move on, is we want you to know that the little scrap center right there at the store is a good place not only to maybe get some inexpensive scrap to practice on, it's a good place to look for other molding profiles that maybe you can take home and kind of test drive or test fit and just see if that's kind of what you want. We talk about different style and purchasing options.
Yeah. So if you have looked around and done some research and picked a profile or a certain look to your molding, you might be fairly confident that's what you want, but once you get in your room, you might feel differently. So again, it's a good idea not only to look for some scraps of different profiles that you might want to consider, but look for different sizes. Because again, you may have decided, I want a certain size. You get a piece of that home and put it up on the wall and you think, you know what, that's bigger than I thought it was going to be. Or it's not as big as I thought it was going to be. It's another way to kind of just get a little more confident in your choices before you actually make the purchase and start the installation.
So now let's get to how to cut the crown molding. I'm going to show you different ways to cut the crown molding depending on where it's being installed. We have a video for you. It's going to walk you through the different options. In it, we focus on inside cuts, outside cuts, and scarf joint cuts. I want you to notice that in the video, you're going to see the labeled cuts. Why is this important? Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, this is super important. These are mine, by the way. These are templates. You want to make the templates first. Number one, because you want to practice. But number two, you have to have these templates next to the saw because now I know that I'm making an inside left corner cut. Let me find my template. Let me turn it upside down, and you're going to see that in the video as well, so that you know exactly how to set the saw. The templates are going to be kind of like a little cheat sheet, if you will, right? Now, here's the deal. We're not sugarcoating it for you. You might get confused. You might get a little frustrated. You might even make some mistakes. But guess what? It is completely normal for that to happen.
Part of learning how to install crown molding is figuring out which cut to use. You will make inside corner cuts, outside corner cuts, and scarf joint cuts. Inside corner cuts, they have a long bottom edge and a short top edge. The cut on the left will angle left. The cut on the right will angle right.
Outside corner cuts. They will have a short bottom edge and a long top. The cut on the right will angle left. The cut on the left will angle right. Scarf cuts. They're used to join two pieces of molding that meet on the wall. The cut will angle the same direction on both sides of the molding.
How you cut your crown molding also depends on what kind of joints will work best. There are two kinds of joints, mitered and coped. Mitered joints meet at the corners in a perfect 90-degree angle or an angle that is close to 90 degrees. Sometimes corners aren't perfect and adjustments need to be made on your cuts.
When this happens, and it will, use an angle finder. This corner is 93 degrees. If you make two 45-degree cuts, the joint will have a gap. So you will set your miter saw at half of the angle total. In this case, 46.5 degrees. Cope joints are a more detailed way of making corner cuts work. We'll discuss this a bit later in the workshop.
Now, when you look at the miter saw, you can see the fence and the table. They meet at a 90-degree angle. This mirrors the 90-degree angle where your wall and ceiling meet. When you are making cuts, think of the table as your ceiling and the fence as your wall. Just imagine flipping your room upside down to fit the saw.
This means that all of your cuts will be made with the molding upside down. This may take a little time to get used to, but marking all of your pieces before you cut will keep you oriented as you're making your cuts.
So we hope that helps you kind of understand all the options on the cuts and the corners. We've been talking about that. But one thing that we did want to reiterate is that upside down business, because that is the hardest thing for people to kind of understand and appreciate, kind of wrap their heads around. Even when we were talking about putting together this workshop, we kind of even struggled with how do we talk about this in a way that makes sense to folks? And we kept coming up with ways that didn't quite do it. So that's why we came up with that little visual of the molding being turned upside down with the ceiling now on the bottom and the wall now on the top. On one hand, that's just the way it's done. You kind of have to just accept that that's the way it's done, but I wanted to give you one more visual to sort of help you understand that. If you look at the miter saw, the way a piece of molding would normally lean out towards you when it's installed, if you put it into the saw like that, as you can see, there's nothing for it to rest on. It's not resting against anything. It's just kind of floating there. There's no way you could make a cut with the molding sitting in there the way it's going to be sitting on the wall. But if you turn it upside down, you'll notice that the top now can be wedged against this little ledge marker here. And then the other side is resting against the back of the fence. So it's nice, or the saw, it's nice and secure and you can make your cuts. So again, it makes sense when you think about why you have to do it, but then you also sort of just have to accept that you have to do it.
Absolutely. But hey, you know what? Guess what? You don't always have to do it. If you don't want to make the miter cut or it freaks you out just a little bit, guess what? We got your back because we have what they call corner blocks. These are pre-done, right? 90-degree angle blocks that can fit inside and outside corners. The beautiful thing about this is there's no miter cutting. You anchor these in your corner, and then you run a straight piece of molding angled appropriately up against these corner blocks. It takes a lot of the I don't know, the kind of intimidation and the kind of the guesswork out of it.
Some of the detail work, because like Ron said, you can see there, this is a 90 degree and there are two 45-degree cuts here, but you didn't have to do them. They're already there. So this kind of takes place of the two cuts you would have had to make in order to make that corner work. And in addition to that, it's just a nice extra, decorative element to your crown molding that you probably wouldn't have had if you had just met two pieces. But again, like Ron said, the piece of molding that's going to butt up against this is just one straight cut, which is the easiest cut, and it's easier to kind of match up against that. So it saves you some of that detail work in the corner. The graphic on the screen now kind of walks you through the details of all these cuts. The other thing about this, like we mentioned this earlier, these cuts are not overly complex, but they can get confusing because you're turning things upside down. So let's look at this piece of molding. If you're looking at this on this side, this cut angles to the right. I don't know if you can see that, but it angles to the right. When you turn it upside, let's say that cut's not there yet. This is the cut you want to make. When you turn it upside down, that cut now angles to the left. So in addition to turning it upside down, you're also turning your cuts upside down in a sense, So they're opposite when you cut them. But that's why this graphic really helps you. It kind of points the cuts and how they kind of need to be made, but it helps you kind of think through what you need to do to create that cut. So again, you've got to think ahead when you make this. You can't move too fast and get ahead of yourself. Think about the cut the way it needs to be in the installation. But remember, when you turn it upside down, it's the opposite direction. So you have to constantly be thinking about what it needs to be when you finish, but how it needs to be cut in order to get there, if that makes sense.
It does. In addition to those inside and outside corner cuts, let's go ahead and kind of get back to that scarf or that butt joint cut. Butt joints are basically straight cuts. You're going to see that again in the upcoming video. That scarf cut is super important. Right here, we've got the outside scarf cut and the inside scarf cut is right here. These are super important because we are going to put them together. These are for those long runs, ladies and gentlemen. So like remember what I said before, super important for you to stop on a stud and a joist, and then start on the stud and joist. You do not want these to separate over time. And the way I've cut them, they're 45 degrees cuts, right? They're 45-degree cuts, but the beautiful thing about it is if they do separate just a little bit, you can go ahead and tidy that up with a little bit of wood filler, right? But when I do these or when you do them, you're going to want to make sure that you glue that and put those together, and then they're not going to absolutely separate.
And one more thing on that. When you're doing a corner cut, your two 45-degree cuts are going in opposite directions because they've got to line up. On these, the two cuts are actually going in the same direction. They're moving in the same direction because they're going to line up on a flat surface and not in a corner. So that's the only difference. You see how those are both going in the same direction? That's the difference between scarfs and regular corner cuts.
If you find yourself getting a little confused, I want you to take a look at the product that we provided for you in your resource or your related informations guide. That graphic is
cut graphic.
Very helpful. And always lean on the template cutting pieces that I've asked you to make prior to starting the actual project. With those two products in hand, you can make this absolutely happen.
Yeah, so again, like Ron said, if you've got these little templates that you've created, and let's say you're working on an outside right cut, you can look at that, think about the angle, turn it upside down, and remind yourself how that needs to look. Even hold that up near the saw when you're making the cut to remind yourself of what you need to do. It can really kind of provide a roadmap throughout the process. Now, we're talking a lot about cutting. Now it's time to cut. So remember the adage, measure twice, cut once. That certainly applies here, maybe more than twice if you need it. But really slow down, think through this. Make sure you're sure and confident of the cuts that you need before you make them. If you make a mistake, that's okay. That's why you have the extra. We talked about that too. But here's a video on the whole process of actually cutting your molding. A power miter saw is the best way to cut molding once you've measured the angles. The saw can be adjusted to cut at any angle. For cutting most crown molding, set it to 45 degrees. This will allow you to cut two pieces of molding that together equal 90 degrees for each corner in your room. But remember, you can adjust that cut if you find that your corner is not 90 degrees. The saw can be set to the left or the right, depending on the angle of the cut you need.
It's important to position the molding correctly on the saw. Remember to think of the floor of the saw as your ceiling and the fence of your saw as your wall.
With the miter saw set to the appropriate angle, place your molding on the saw. It might be helpful to add an X to the piece you won't be using for this part of the install as you make your cuts.
Double check your molding and make sure you know which side of the cut is waste and which side will be installed to ensure that you are making the correct cut.
Always make sure that the flat edges of your molding are tight against the fence and the bottom base of the miter saw. If you are ever unsure about your cut, use a scrap piece of wood to test the angle in the cut. The less experienced you are at using a miter saw, the more important this consideration is, but it's obviously not required.
If you do not have a miter saw, cuts can be made with a hand saw in a miter box. The downside of this option is much more labor intensive and can result in cuts that are not as clean as those made with a miter saw. As you can see, the miter box cut on the left is much rougher and ragged than a miter saw cut on the right.
If you would like some guidance on using a power miter saw, be sure to check out our online video on how to use a miter saw. The link is in our resource guide that you can download with this course.
A cope joint is when you cut the end of one piece of molding straight and install it flush into the corner of the wall. That is known as a butt cut or a butt joint. Then you cut the other piece of molding at a 45-degree angle and then carve it specifically to fit the profile or the shape of the first piece of molding.
Again, this involves a 45-degree cut to the second piece of molding, marking a cut line with a pencil, and hand cutting the edge to match the profile of that first piece of molding. This technique is popular for wood molding that will be stained because simply staining the wood makes it harder to cover up any mistakes.
However, most first-time do-it-yourselfers will probably find this process a little too complicated and prefer the more common method of making two angled cuts, knowing that any imperfections can be easily covered with caulk and painted.
Finally, you will need to file or sand the profile edge of any coped cut to get it as smooth as possible. Just be careful not to change the profile as you file. If that happens, it will no longer align with that first piece of molding.
If you decide you want this type of tight finished joint, but don't want to spend time learning how and making the joint yourself, know that we have pre-coped crown molding and packages at homedepot.com. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, it's not horribly hard, but you've got to pay attention and you've got to label your cuts. Tell yourself what's going to be waste material, what's not. Angling the saw is going to be important. Always look back over the graphic that we provided for you. And I promise you that in conjunction with templates is going to help you make the project fun so you can do it again and again.
Right. And don't get ahead of yourself. Make sure that you don't plan to do this in an afternoon, because if you limit the amount of time you have available to do it, you're going to rush and you're going to make mistakes. And sometimes they're mistakes that you can't come back from. So take your time, leave yourself lots of time. And like Ron said, don't forget that diagram that you've made, because that is your key. That is your map for the entire project. So as you're going around the room, thinking about your cuts, working with different pieces of molding, you've hopefully have listed on your diagram that this wall needs a 12-foot piece. Well, when you make the 12-foot piece or you're cutting the 12-foot piece, you've made a note on your diagram that this side of the piece has a certain kind of a cut at a certain angle. Write that on the diagram, write it on the molding. So you're just ensuring throughout the process that you know and you're confirming what the cut is and you know the length, and then you're actually doing it. And what about, Ron? I know some people like to cut all of their molding at once. Pros tend to do that. We don't think that first-time DIYers should. Why is that?
Okay, so first of all, pros are going to do that. Number one, because they've done it 1,000 times. And it makes sense because it's a time saver. I'm going to make all my measurements. I'm going to go out to my saw. I'm going to make all my cuts. I'm going to label all my lumber, all my crown, where it's going to go. I'm going to bring it all back inside. I'm going to drop it everywhere it needs to go, and then I'm going to install it. Sounds nice, right? In real world, do-it-yourselfers shouldn't do it that way. I want you to cut and install one wall at a time. Why do I want you to do that? Because you are going to make some mistakes. I want you to cut the crown a little long, and then I want you to walk your cut back just a little bit until it fits nice and perfect, and then move on to another side. By doing that, you can ensure that you're going to get the most bang for your buck out of the money that you've invested in your material, and you're going to have fun along the way. Is it going to take a little longer, Mike?
Yes, but that's okay.
It is definitely okay.
And think about it. Pros and contractors, they're on the clock. They're trying to find ways to save time, and they've done this a lot, so they're less likely to make a mistake. That may not apply to you. You might be more likely to make a mistake. So you don't want to make a bunch of mistakes and then realize it at the end and you've ruined all your molding. If you make a few mistakes here and there, and you might, and that's okay, but then you'll know not to do it again. So it's another reason to kind of take it step by step.
Now, we showed you how to cope in the actual video. First time do-it-yourselfers, have at it if you want to do it that way. I prefer you use the angle finder for your inside corners and you make an angled cut. The coping process takes a lot of time. If you want to work that out, what I suggest you do is get more scrap crown from the scrap area at Home Depot and go home and just practice, practice, practice making those cope joint cuts. Um, because ultimately you want it to fit, you want it to look good. I prefer the angle finder method. It's worked for me for years and years and years. I don't get paid to do this. I'm a do-it-yourselfer just like you guys are, but I promise you that's the good way to go.
Yes. Now, we've talked about measuring, we've talked about planning, we've talked about cutting, we've done all that. Now it's time to actually install the molding, and we've got another video that will walk you through those steps. Before you start the install, measure your walls again. It's always a good idea to double check your measurements before committing to the installation of your molding.
Consider cutting your molding a little longer than measured. The extra length allows you to make adjustments to the cuts to make them fit well. You can always take a little more off if needed, but if you make your cuts too short, you could end up wasting a piece of molding.
Make the cuts you need. Angled cuts for corners and scarf joints, or straight cuts for half of a cope joint or corner blocks.
Dry fit the molding in place. Use a level to set the molding or draw a line where the bottom of the crown molding will lay. This will help you keep the molding straight for the entire room.
Attach the molding to the wall and ceiling using the finish nailer. Apply wood glue to both halves of your miter cuts. This will help ensure your joints don't separate over time due to expansion or settling of your home. You then shoot nails along the molding at the points where you've marked the wall studs and the ceiling joists.
Putty any nail holes and seams as necessary to finish the job. Allow that to dry according to the product instructions and sand them flush and smooth. If you're painting the molding after installation, you can add painter's tape along the seam and run a bead of caulk to fill those gaps. Wipe it smooth with a wet finger or a damp rag.
So there you go. The installation is now complete.
I think it's important for us to try to go over kind of the things that they're going to need in order to actually do the project.
Yep.
So let's start off with a tape measure, good quality tape measure, things to look for really quick in a tape measure. I love the blade to be nice and thick. The blade nice and thick keeps it from snapping. I can go out 14 foot with this before it snaps. That's super important when you're dealing with things on your own. You don't have someone else holding it, right? You can't necessarily see it on here, but this is going to be front to back thickness of about 3¼ inches. They're going to be different based on size. Why is that important? Well, we've all done this. I guarantee you we've all done this. We've all put the tape measure in the corner and we bent it.
Especially if you're by yourself and you're trying to judge. Sometimes you're like, well, if you're doing it this way, you might just bend it and guess. That might be okay on some things where you're getting a rough idea. But again, for molding, you're being very specific. So you don't want to do that.
Yep, it's real, real important. You butt it into the corner and you are on target. You have a perfect measurement. You make that cut. You make sure that angle is correct, and that's going to be a nice tight miter. Next, moving on is the level. Everybody needs a good quality level. Level is going to help you keep that crown level because guess what? Your walls are never going to be really straight. Your ceilings are never going to be straight. There might be a little bows and stuff in it. Ultimately, you want your bottom part of your crown to be level all the way across. We can work with the top. The bottom needs to be nice and level. A good quality level, I suggest about a 6-foot level because that can be used in lots of different projects. Pencils, because the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to put my crown molding on the wall. I'm going to mark my line on the wall, and I'm going to follow that with little scrap piece all the way down till that line is nice and straight.
Real quick, one point about that. You know, like Ron said, sometimes you're going to find that your ceiling is not as level as you think it is. One little part might bow or sag just a hair. Why does that matter? If you start kind of dry fitting this molding along the ceiling and you're making your line, suddenly you hit a spot where it comes down just a little bit. Well, that line's going to be lower than the rest. If that happens, you've got to account for that. What you can do, find the lowest point where the molding can go based on if there's a dip, use that as the bottom for everything else. So before you start making the line, it's a good idea to kind of check and see if you're going to run into that, and then you account for that. And we're not talking about a big gap. We're talking about a little bit of a difference. But if you hit that and you haven't accounted for it, suddenly the bottom of the molding is going to be a little bit off. So it's something to think about. Find the lowest point that's the highest point they can be with accounting for that dip, and then use that as the baseline with a level for all of the molding. What about cutting? What about miter saws?
Well, power miter saw is going to be the best way to go. Once again, you can rent these if you don't want to buy one. There are different levels for different types of jobs. This is a 12-inch, what we call a dual bevel miter saw. It's a great miter saw. It has like a laser level, so you know exactly where you're cutting. Just got to be careful with these things. Safety is a must. One of the things that you want to make sure that you don't do is you don't wear gloves with these. Any kind of device that cuts and the blade goes round and round and round, you don't want to wear gloves because you don't want the glove to get caught on the blade. Now, they have some integrated safety kind of apparatuses on them that kind of can keep that from happening. But just as a good rule of thumb, don't wear gloves when dealing with this kind of work, and don't have baggy sleeves or anything that can get caught and pull you into the saw. That's not a good thing.
Yeah, we don't want to scare you. At the end of the day, this is your best friend because it's the fastest, cleanest way to make these cuts. And again, if you don't want to buy one and invest in one, you can always rent one. But if you decide a power miter saw is not the way to go for you, you've got another option, and that is a miter box. This is just a manual way to make those same cuts. It is manual. You're going to put your molding in here, and you're going to cut it by hand. Very physical. It's going to take a lot longer. Those cuts are not going to be as smooth. You also don't have as many options for angles. There are preset angles on here. So if you run into one of those corners that's 93 degrees and you need to make a cut that's not on here, you're going to have a bigger gap and have to deal with that later. But it's obviously an option if that's the way you want to go.
Next, finish nailer. Ladies and gentlemen, this is definitely a must. You're going to want a finish nailer. Highly recommend 15 gauge, 16 gauge finish nails, 2.5 inches in length. Some safety when dealing with your nail gun. You always want to remove the power source, whether that's a battery or whether that's a compression hose, before you actually open up and fill with nails. You always want to do that first because you don't want the nail gun to, I don't know,
Be able to operate.
Yeah, be able to operate. So that's something to consider. And like I said, if you don't want to buy one of these, you can definitely rent one of these at the Home Depot rental center. Then we have a coping saw. The key for this is to make sure that you get a blade with lots and lots and lots of teeth. The more teeth, the cleaner the cut. Just remember that. This is used for so it can angle and do different things.
Next up is a ladder. Obviously, you're going to be up near the ceiling doing this project, so you're going to need a ladder. Now, if you've got a tall ladder, you can certainly use that, but some things you want to consider. You know, if your ceiling is 10 foot high, you want your ladder to be at least a couple of feet lower than that so that you're not having to go to the top of the ladder and you can lean, you've got some points of contact. But you might want to consider if you need to get a ladder, instead of just a normal step ladder, we do have lots of ladders that at the top have a platform, and they're made to be stood on for projects like this, where you're standing up on the ladder for long periods of time. So if you're looking to buy a ladder, you might want to go that route.
Now, safety. You want to protect yourself. You got to get yourself a good pair of safety glasses. You can get ones that actually fit over your eyeglasses as well. In addition to that, if you're dealing with a power miter saw or a compressor with a nail gun, you're going to want to have some kind of ear protection, whether they're inner ear or over the ear.
If you've never used a nailer, know that when the nails go in, they go in a little further than the surface of the wood. What does that mean? It's going to leave little small holes all along your project. That's okay because you can fill it with plastic wood or wood filler. That's going to allow you to go in and kind of fill that in. It's kind of like spackle in a way. Fills that in, let it dry, then you sand it before you paint. But then there's also wood glue.
And the wood glue is necessary, ladies and gentlemen, for those outside corners. You're going to want to get a good quality wood glue. You want to glue those outside corners together. When you glue those outside corners together, guess what happens? When they're actually anchored to the wall and the wall expands and contracts, and it will due to temperature, your miters aren't going to pull apart. You don't want to do that. And then one other or two other little things that I like to kind of discuss with you is, say, for instance, you're doing this project by yourself, and you can, because you have these little tools right here. This is called a crown molding hanger clip. HomeDepot.com has them. You're going to put a couple of these throughout the run of the crown. You're going to cut the crown, you've test fitted it, but then you're going to go ahead and put them up into the hanger. So now they're hung as close to the wall as they possibly can. You'll get up there, you'll remove the first one, you'll hold it in place, you'll anchor it in place. Then you kind of will move down the line, removing them. On average, about 3 of those hanger clips per about 10 to 12 feet will get it done for you. And last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, the secret sauce. This is the secret to a molding project. Like I said before, walls are generally not going to be 90 degrees in the corners. You're going to have some crazy measurements where it might be 93 or it might be 88 degrees. I can go from interior corner, or that's an exterior corner, to an interior corner, and it will tell me exactly what I need for my cut to be.
So before we leave you, we wanted to give you a few more installation tips and kind of wrap up everything that we've talked about. Remember to get extra molding because you're going to need it. You're probably going to make a mistake. Know that going in. It's not a problem, but just know that you need a little bit extra just in case. Also, don't forget to pick up some of those scrap materials that you'll find in the molding aisle so you can make some practice cuts.
Man, I got a tip for you. Ladies and gentlemen, pros don't even typically do this. I want you to paint the molding before you install it. Paint the front and the back. Now, when you putty the nail holes, you're going to have to touch it up after you putty nail holes and you put a bead of caulk up there. It's going to be a whole lot more simple for you to do a touch up rather than try to paint the whole thing. And do the front and the back as well. When you do the back, it prevents any kind of warping to the wood itself. Because guess what? Moisture will find its way in places, and that's a really, really good tip, and you don't want that molding to warp.
Yep.
Now, Mike, if I don't want to invest in the miter saw or the nail guns, or I just don't have that big ladder that I need, is there a place I can get it?
Home Depot tool rental is the place because, a lot of these different tools that we've talked about, not only it's an investment, right? It's a power tool, but you may never use it again. You may not be sure you're going to use it again. So it's always a good option if you don't know you want to make that investment to rent it. We talked about the options for cutting. You can go the power route or the manual route. But if you want a power miter saw and you don't want to buy one, you can always rent one. But we have lots of power tools and different options in rental that will save you time and money. In addition to trucks, if you're doing any kind of project and you need a bunch of stuff from the Home Depot and you've got a small car, you can always rent a truck there as well.
And here's the best part of it. You don't have to store it. You come, you pick it up from us, you use it, you bring it back. There's no upkeep, no fuss, no muss. It is all done.
Yeah, so that's it for this workshop. We've covered a lot of ground. Ron, what are some of the things we talked about?
Oh man, just to get started, we talked about how to select it. We gave you an overview on molding. We talked about crown molding in detail. We kind of helped you with that plan to prep and get ready for an install. We talked about how to measure. We talked about how to cut it. We gave you some different options of cutting as well. We also talked about installation and finishing, and hopefully we gave you some tips and some tricks and some ideas and the information that will help you tackle those crown molding projects. And I don't want the customers to worry about if they didn't get it all. This is a lot to take in, a lot of information. We have that resource guide available to you in the related information. It is going to have a PDF file that is going to have everything that we talked about today and links to how to use that miter saw, how to use that nail gun, and how to get more done. Boom.
Yep. So on behalf of the entire Workshops Live crew here at the Home Depot, we do want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. We hope that you now have some competence and confidence that maybe you didn't have prior to the workshop and are ready to tackle and be successful in your crown molding project. And of course, we hope you join us for some other workshops in the future. So for everyone here at Home Depot, thank you for joining us and enjoy your project.